Security cameras captured everything. 3 armed intruders, 1 elderly night security guard. Nobody expected this outcome, because no one knew that the ordinary guard was actually a war machine who had served 20 years in special forces. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit the subscribe button and help us honor those who should never be forgotten. Nobody knew his real name. On the duty roster, he was simply listed as Frank Morrison, night security, building maintenance. 12 years he'd walked the same corridors, checked the same doors, sat at the same desk in the lobby of the Meridian Tower downtown. 12 years of quiet, methodical rounds through 37 floors of law offices, accounting firms, and corporate headquarters that emptied every evening at 6 p.m. sharp. The day shift guards knew him only as the guy who took over when they went home. Polite nod, brief handoff of the security log, and Frank would settle into his post for another 8 hours of solitude. He never complained, never requested time off, never caused problems. The building management considered him their most reliable employee, the kind of man who showed up regardless of weather, holidays, or personal circumstances. He wore the same navy blue uniform every night, perfectly pressed despite its obvious age. His badge read F. Morrison in simple block letters. No decorations, no personal touches. His boots were black leather, worn but meticulously maintained. They made no sound as he walked the marble floors, a skill that seemed almost unnatural for a man in his 60s. The security desk sat in the center of the lobby, positioned to overlook the main entrance and the elevator bank. From this vantage point, Frank could monitor the building's 12 security cameras, each feeding a different angle of the common areas. During his shifts, he would cycle through the feeds methodically, checking each floor in sequence. First floor retail spaces, second through fifth floors of legal offices, 6th through 15th floors of corporate suites, and so on up to the 37th floor executive level. Most nights were routine. The occasional late worker burning midnight oil in their office, cleaning crews making their rounds, the predictable parade of delivery personnel and maintenance contractors. Frank logged everything, noting times, badge numbers, and purposes for after-hours access. His handwriting was precise, almost military in its consistency. Each entry was complete, factual, and devoid of unnecessary commentary. The other building employees had various opinions about Frank. The day shift receptionist thought he was shy, maybe a bit antisocial. The cleaning crew supervisor found him respectful but distant. The building maintenance manager appreciated his reliability, but noted that Frank never joined in casual conversations or break-room discussions. If pressed to describe him, most would use words like quiet, dependable, and keeps to himself. What they didn't notice were the details that spoke to something deeper. The way Frank's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for anomalies. How he positioned himself with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. The fact that he never sat with his back to a doorway. His habit of testing door locks with a pressure that suggested he understood the difference between secure and merely closed. Frank's routine was invariable. Arrive at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before shift change. Receive briefing from the evening guard, usually nothing more than "all quiet, sir." Review the day's access log and any maintenance notices. Begin first round at exactly 11 p.m. The rounds took 43 minutes to complete if done properly, checking every floor, every stairwell, every emergency exit. He would return to the desk, update the log, and monitor cameras until 1 a.m. when he would begin his second round. On this particular Thursday night in November, Frank began his shift like any other. The building was nearly empty except for a few lawyers on the 18th floor working on what appeared to be an urgent case filing, normal for a firm billing by the hour. The weather outside was cold and wet, the kind of night that kept honest people indoors and sometimes brought out the worst in others. At 11 p.m., Frank started his first round. Basement level, mechanical rooms, parking garage, everything secure. Ground floor retail spaces, all properly locked and alarmed. Stairwells clear. He moved through the building like clockwork, noting the time at each checkpoint in his log. The lawyers were still working when he checked the 18th floor. Through the glass conference room doors, he could see them hunched over documents, coffee cups, and takeout containers scattered across the table. Frank made a mental note to check on them during his next round. Late-night workers sometimes forgot to properly secure their offices when they finally left. By 11:43 p.m., Frank was back at his desk, updating the security log. Everything normal. He settled into his chair and began cycling through the camera feeds. The building's security system was state-of-the-art, installed 3 years earlier after the property management company decided to upgrade from the aging system that had protected the building since the 1990s. 12 cameras covered the common areas, 4 in the lobby and elevator bank, 2 per floor covering the main corridors on floors with 24-hour access, and 2 rooftop cameras monitoring the building's perimeter. The system could record continuously or be set to motion-activated recording. Frank preferred continuous recording during his shifts. You never knew what details might prove important later. At 12:15 a.m., Frank noticed something unusual on camera 7, which monitored the service entrance at the building's north side. A dark sedan had pulled into the loading dock area and sat there with its engine running. Not uncommon for late-night deliveries, but Frank hadn't been notified of any scheduled arrivals. He watched for several minutes. No one got out of the car. No attempt to contact security or use the service entrance intercom. Frank made a note in the log. 12:17 a.m. Unidentified vehicle at north service entrance. Monitoring. He switched to camera 8, which covered the same area from a different angle. The sedan's license plate wasn't clearly visible due to the lighting, but Frank could make out 3 figures inside the vehicle. At 12:23 a.m., the car's doors opened. 3 men got out, all wearing dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Frank reached for the phone to call building security's main office, but then he stopped. Something about the way the men moved caught his attention. They weren't walking like delivery personnel or maintenance workers. They moved with purpose, checking their surroundings, communicating with hand signals. Frank's training kicked in before his conscious mind could process what he was seeing. 23 years of military service, 8 years in conventional forces, and 15 years in special operations. Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and half a dozen other places that didn't appear on official deployment records. His body remembered what his civilian life had tried to forget. The 3 men approached the service entrance. One of them produced something from his jacket. Frank couldn't see clearly on the camera, but the motion was familiar. Lockpicks, maybe, or something more sophisticated. The service entrance was supposed to be secured with both electronic locks and physical deadbolts. Frank knew because he checked it twice every shift. Instead of reaching for the phone again, Frank opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Behind the building maintenance manuals and spare flashlight batteries was a small black notebook. He flipped to a page near the back and studied the floor plans he'd hand-drawn and annotated over his 12 years of employment. Not the official architectural drawings. Those showed what the building was supposed to look like. Frank's diagrams showed what it actually looked like. Blind spots in camera coverage, alternate routes between floors, the locations of emergency equipment, and communication hubs. On camera 7, one of the intruders appeared to have defeated the service entrance locks. The door opened, and all 3 men disappeared inside the building. Frank glanced at the elevator monitoring panel. The service elevator showed no activity. They were taking the stairs. Frank locked his desk drawer and stood up. For the first time in 12 years, he deviated from standard security protocol. Instead of calling for backup or notifying law enforcement, he moved toward the main elevator bank. But he didn't call an elevator. Instead, he opened the emergency stairwell door and began climbing. His movements were different now. Gone was the casual gait of an aging security guard making routine rounds. Frank moved like a predator, each step calculated and silent. He climbed 4 flights of stairs without breathing hard, his body falling back into patterns learned decades earlier in very different circumstances. The service stairwell connected to the main stairwells on every floor. Frank knew that the intruders would most likely target the upper floors, where the high-value law firms and financial services companies kept their offices, sensitive documents, computer equipment, possibly cash or valuables, stored in office safes. At the 5th floor landing, Frank stopped and listened. Footsteps echoed from somewhere above, moving quickly but trying to remain quiet. Amateur hour, Frank thought. Real professionals would have taken the time to map guard rotations and camera coverage before attempting entry. These three were opportunists, probably hoping to grab what they could and disappear before anyone noticed. Frank continued climbing. At the 8th floor, he heard voices, low, urgent whispers coming from the corridor beyond the stairwell door. He approached the door carefully and peered through the small window. One of the intruders was standing watch at the elevator bank while the other two worked on the locks of a law firm's main entrance. Now, Frank faced a decision. He could retreat to the security desk, call police, and wait for backup. Standard procedure, minimal risk, by-the-book response. Or he could handle this the way he'd been trained to handle situations where backup wasn't coming and failure wasn't an option. The man at the elevator bank was armed. Frank could see the outline of a pistol tucked into his waistband. Probably all three were armed, which meant this wasn't just breaking and entering. This was armed robbery, possibly worse if they encountered any of the late-working lawyers. Frank reached into his jacket and withdrew an item that wasn't part of any security guard's standard equipment. A tactical knife, military issue, worn smooth from years of use. He'd carried it through 3 combat deployments and a dozen classified operations. Old habits, it turned out, died harder than old soldiers. The stairwell door opened silently. Frank had oiled the hinges himself months earlier, claiming it was routine maintenance. Everything he'd done over 12 years of seemingly ordinary employment had been preparation for a moment he'd hoped would never come. The intruder standing watch and never heard Frank approach. One moment he was checking his phone, probably timing his partner's progress. The next moment, he was unconscious on the carpet, secured with plastic zip ties that Frank produced from another pocket. The man's weapon was now in Frank's possession, safety engaged, ammunition checked automatically. 2 down, 1 to go. Frank moved toward the law firm's entrance where the remaining intruders were still working on the locks. Through the glass doors, he could see them inside the reception area, flashlights sweeping across filing cabinets and computer workstations. Frank tried the door handle, locked, but these particular locks he knew intimately. Every night for 12 years, he'd checked every door in the building. He knew which ones were loose, which ones required extra pressure, and which ones had been installed incorrectly by contractors who'd cut corners. The door opened silently. Frank stepped inside and waited, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The 2 intruders were in the main office area, focused on a large safe mounted behind the reception desk. They'd found the prize they were looking for. "Where's Tommy?" one of them whispered. "He should have checked in by now." "Probably fell asleep," the other replied. "You know how he gets when he's bored." Frank smiled grimly. Tommy wasn't sleeping. Tommy was going to wake up with a headache and some uncomfortable questions to answer when the police arrived. The 2 men were so focused on the safe that they didn't notice Frank until he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said quietly. Both intruders spun around, flashlights and weapons swinging toward the source of the voice, but Frank was no longer where his voice had originated. 20 years of small unit tactics had taught him never to remain stationary after revealing his position. "Looking for something?" Frank asked from a different location. The intruders were panicking now, sweeping their lights frantically around the office. One of them fired a shot in Frank's general direction, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding both men and revealing their exact positions to Frank, who had anticipated the shot and shielded his eyes. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Frank moved through the darkened office like a ghost, using furniture and office equipment for cover. The intruders had training, probably military or law enforcement backgrounds, but they'd been out of the game too long. Their movements were sloppy, their communication non-existent under pressure. Frank disarmed the first intruder with a textbook knife hand strike that rendered the man's gun arm useless. The weapon clattered across the floor and disappeared under a desk. The second intruder got off one more shot before Frank closed the distance and ended the engagement with techniques that hadn't appeared in any security guard training manual. By 12:47 a.m., all 3 intruders were secured with zip ties and arranged in the law firm's conference room. Frank had retrieved their weapons and conducted a quick search for additional threats. None found. He checked each man for injuries, some bruising, nothing requiring immediate medical attention. Frank returned to the security desk and made 3 phone calls. The first was to 911, reporting an attempted break-in at the Meridian Tower and requesting police response. The second was to building management, notifying them of the incident and requesting an emergency maintenance team to repair the service entrance. The third call was to the law firm whose office had been breached, informing them that their security had been compromised, but no property appeared to have been stolen. When the police arrived at 1:15 a.m., they found Frank waiting in the lobby, looking exactly like what he appeared to be, an elderly security guard who'd had an eventful night. The three intruders were found exactly where Frank had left them, conscious but subdued, zip ties replaced with proper handcuffs by the responding officers. Detective Sarah Chen, who took Frank's statement, found his account clear and factual. 3 armed men had attempted to break into the building. Frank had discovered them during his routine rounds and had managed to detain them until police arrived. How exactly had a 65-year-old security guard managed to subdue 3 armed intruders? "Lucky, I guess," Frank replied. "They weren't expecting any resistance." Detective Chen wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation, but Frank's story was consistent. The evidence supported his version of events, and the intruders weren't talking. Sometimes cases wrapped up cleanly, and she'd learned not to question good fortune. The paperwork took until 3:30 a.m. Frank completed his incident report with the same precise handwriting he used for routine log entries. Building management arrived to assess the damage and arrange for upgraded security measures. The law firm's senior partner showed up to check on his files and expressed gratitude for Frank's actions. By 4 a.m., the building was quiet again. Frank resumed his normal duties, completing his rounds and monitoring the cameras. When the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., they found everything in order except for the yellow police tape around the service entrance and a brief note in the security log about minor incident resolved, see attached reports. The story might have ended there, except for Detective Chen's curiosity. Something about Frank's demeanor during the interview had struck her as unusual. Not suspicious exactly, but professionally familiar. She'd grown up in a military family and had spent enough time around career soldiers to recognize certain characteristics: posture, speech patterns, the way someone carried themselves under stress. 3 days later, Detective Chen decided to run a background check on Frank Morrison. What she found surprised her. Frank Morrison, the security guard, had appeared in employment records 12 years earlier with impeccable references, but no detailed history prior to his hiring at Meridian Tower. No military service records, no previous employment in security or law enforcement, no criminal history. For a man in his 60s, Frank Morrison had remarkably little past. Detective Chen made some unofficial inquiries through her contacts in federal law enforcement. 2 days later, she received a phone call from someone who identified himself only as a colleague who worked in personnel security. "Stop looking," the voice said. "Frank Morrison is exactly who he appears to be, a security guard who did his job and helped arrest 3 criminals. Nothing more to investigate." "But his background," Detective Chen started to say. "His background is none of your concern," the voice interrupted. "Some people prefer to leave their past in the past. Recommend you do the same." The line went dead. Detective Chen considered pursuing the matter further, but she was a practical person with enough active cases to keep her busy. Frank Morrison had stopped 3 armed intruders and possibly prevented a major robbery. Whether he'd learned his skills in the military, law enforcement, or watching action movies was ultimately irrelevant to the case. Frank, meanwhile, returned to his regular routine: night shift, building rounds, security logs. The incident report was filed away and forgotten. Building management installed additional security measures and gave Frank a commendation letter for his dedication to duty. The only visible change was small. Frank began carrying a different flashlight during his rounds, one with a heavier construction that could serve multiple purposes if necessary. And sometimes, late at night when the building was empty and quiet, he would pause during his rounds and listen to the silence, remembering other times and places where silence meant survival. 1 month after the incident, a new employee started work at a law firm on the 23rd floor. Former military, like many lawyers who specialized in veterans affairs. During his first week, he encountered Frank during a late-night work session. "Excuse me," the lawyer said as Frank checked the corridor during his rounds. "I heard about what happened last month. 3 armed guys, and you handled them yourself." Frank paused at the elevator bank and looked at the younger man. Something in the lawyer's posture and the way he asked the question suggested more than casual curiosity. "Lucky night," Frank replied. The lawyer studied Frank's face for a moment, then nodded. "Luck's important. But training helps too." Frank pressed the button for the elevator. "Sometimes," he said. As the elevator doors opened, the lawyer added, "If you ever want to talk about anything, deployments, adjustments, whatever, my door's always open. Some conversations are easier with people who've been there." Frank stepped into the elevator and turned around. For just a moment, his expression shifted, revealing glimpses of the man behind the security guard's uniform. "Appreciate the offer," Frank said, "but some conversations are better left unfinished." The elevator doors closed, and Frank continued his rounds. Just another quiet night at the Meridian Tower, another set of floors to check, another log entry to complete. Outside, the city slept peacefully, protected by people like Frank Morrison, who stood watch in the darkness, asking nothing in return except the chance to serve without recognition. The security cameras continued to record everything, capturing images of an elderly man in a navy blue uniform making his methodical rounds through empty corridors. What they couldn't capture was the weight of experience he carried, the knowledge that some skills are never truly forgotten, and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled without expectation of praise or acknowledgement. Frank Morrison, night security guard, defender of the peace, keeper of secrets that would remain forever unspoken in the silence between midnight and dawn.